Okay, so yeah, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar leading through the AI revolution. So Ash and I are going to be having a conversation around this subject and covering off a number of different things throughout. But before we do that, so introductions. So I'm Stu Day. I'm one of the managing principal consultants here at 1010. I've been with the organization for approaching 5 months, so still relatively new, I think, within the organization. But I've had an amazing relationship with 1010 for a number of years. I've actually been a customer of 1010 as well, and been had success with the academy model, the consultancy model, and so on. I'm 30 years in the industry as a whole, in quality engineering, tech leadership. Um, I know what you're all thinking. I don't look old enough to have 30 years in the industry. But believe me, yeah, it is. It is. But I'm joined by the lovely Ash Gawthorpe. I'm going to hand over to Ash to introduce yourself, Ash, and maybe a bit more about 1010.
Perfect. Thanks, Stu. Well, the lovely Ash Goldthorpe. That's the introduction. Thanks, Stu. So, Ash, CTO and co-founder, been with 1010, gosh, 18, 19 years, 30 years in the industry as well, Stu. So, but I can say categorically, I feel every single one of those years that
Yeah.
I spent in it. So my background is hardware engineering, software engineering, architecture, and automation. 1010 is a tech consultancy focused on automation, cloud, quality engineering, with a number of unique sort of delivery models, including our consulting organization, our academy organization for early careers talent, and the ability to combine both of those
Mm.
into a sort of cohesive whole, delivering the best of both worlds, really. And of course, more recently, in the last kind of year, we found ourselves doing a lot more automation, moving now into agentic AI agents. So
Yeah.
automation at some level, but ultimately with LLMs at their core. Um, so whilst on the one hand that's very new, I think it's fair to say that actually within software engineering and systems engineering, most things are an evolution, not a revolution. And this is no exception, really. There's a lot of agentic AI, which is new, but at the same time, there's
Mm.
a lot of it which is built on traditional software engineering, system engineering practices. And I think the fact that we've got those LLMs in the loop actually makes it even more important in some ways that those fundamentals are there and right, and we can come onto that maybe a little bit further down the line. But what I'd also like to do is to run through some points, but then also just focus a little bit on some of our customer stories. What's worked well with
Yes.
them, what's not worked well with them, and sort of go from there. Really, I think.
Yeah, we've got a great conversation lined up, haven't we, Ash? And obviously, we're going to be sharing our own thoughts on as we step through this. But it is a very open conversation, and if you have any questions that you want to throw into the Q&A box, by all means, please do. If you've got any comments, just you want to put into the chat around the challenges you're maybe facing. This is very much a discussion around what strategic considerations that we think we need to be looking at as we embed AI and implement AI into our businesses. So yeah, so please do share some questions. We'll try and get to as many as possible at the end, but if we don't get to them all, then we will pick them up afterwards, like we did with our previous webinar, and do some recording off the back of that. So I think we should probably just get into this then and get into the conversation. What do you reckon, Ash?
Yeah, yeah, let's go for it. Yep.
Yeah. So as mentioned, so we wanted to run this webinar today because it's becoming more and more apparent that for many organizations, the AI experimentation phase is coming to an end. It's moving beyond sort of that proof of concept project to a core requirement for businesses to be successful. There's a lot of pressure on businesses, there's a lot of pressure on leaders to embed AI, make AI work. And throughout this conversation, we're going to talk around some of those challenges and some of the things that may help moving forward. So Ash, where should we get started, do you think?
How about, I mean, you were talking about moving from the pilot phase into that kind of production phase, and lots of people have been
Yeah,
experimenting with it. Maybe that's a good place to start in terms of that
yeah.
strategic ROI, or often actually lack of it. And the fact that
Yes.
often many of these things don't move from a pilot phase to a production phase. And maybe
Mm,
go into a little bit around why that is, some of the reasons for that, and maybe what you can do to mitigate against it a little bit.
yeah.
I mean, I think it's certainly fair to say that in the market, it's a very mixed bag. That we're seeing this kind of this juxtaposition between, on the one hand, you've got the frontier labs and all the marketing hype saying AI is amazing, it can do all kinds of clever things, sort of PhD level in certain areas. It's becoming better and better with every iteration and every day that passes. But then on the other hand, when you look at actually organizations' experience of it, they find that very often that they can produce a pilot, but they're not able to take it further than that, that there are
Mm,
things which stop them. So on the one hand, these models are very clever. On the other hand, they're often doing very, very stupid things, which can actually limit your ability to be able
yeah.
to be effective with them. And when you sort of look at some of the stats out there, it's not great reading. So the MIT
Mm,
report last year, 95% of AI projects fail to deliver ROI.
yeah.
88% of projects never reach production. And only 8.6% of organizations actually have AI agents in production. And
Mm,
I think there's a few reasons for these. And we've seen some of these reasons ourselves from our own experiences of going into organizations where they've tried to pilot some of this stuff. And I guess there's three key reasons, really. The first one is that the great thing about AI is that you're able to generate things very quickly, whether that's code, whether that's proof of concepts.
yeah.
And so they're able to do the thing often that you want them to do very, very quickly. And they're able to do it. So they look and they appear to be very, very real, and they appear to be complete,
Mm,
and they appear
yeah.
to be, frankly, in a very good state. But from our experience, there is a huge chasm between a working pilot and a production ready solution. And
Yeah.
often that boils down to, as I mentioned at the start, some of those very common core system and software engineering practices. But the impact of that can be quite bad from a business point of view, because if you've demonstrated to a senior stakeholder who's not a tech practitioner, if you've shown them something where they need to do a thing and you've demonstrated that it can do a thing,
Mm,
they are not thinking to themselves, "Oh, okay, yeah, great. So I'm one user. How's it scale to 1,000 or 10,000 concurrent users? We've got this knowledge base in there. It's got 3 documents in it. How's that scale to 1 million documents?
yeah.
What happens if I go off the happy path in terms of that? What are the concerns around getting this wrong? People don't
Mm,
think like that unless they come from a background where they need to. And so
yeah.
you've shown them something working with their very eyes, and they've seen it working. So from their minds, it's often a very short step to them being able to take that into production and have that working in a production environment. And I think a lot of these things scale or fail to scale because of underestimating the challenges and complexity of those LLMs, and the fact that previously you've had deterministic software where you put the same data in, you do the same processing, you'll get the same data out. Nowadays with an LLM at its core, the only thing you can know for certain is that if you put the same data in, you will not get the same data out twice out of that LLM. And so you have to bake and build in a lot of the structure, a lot of the guidance, a lot of the guardrails,
Mm,
literally guardrails, to be able to engineer some of that deterministic properties back into the thing. And that's
yeah.
that's the thing that I think many people underestimate. And I think the third one sometimes is that we've had definitions of done within software for a long time. We need that for AI. There needs to be a recognition that done is certainly not demonstrating that the thing can work on a small scale to a senior stakeholder. In actual fact, I'd argue it's not even the case that you've got a production ready system which is actually running. There are parts beyond
Mm,
that. You need to know that you can support it, because once you put this out there in the wild, you're building systems, you're building software with all the
yeah.
responsibility that comes with that. You can't just walk away from that if these systems become business critical and they're using it in the business. Um,
Mm,
that's a very, very important consideration, how you support it. And in fact, I think more importantly, one thing we're seeing a lot of is organizations using third parties to be able to develop this capability for them, But then that overarching question of what happens when they ride off into the sunset, what are you left with?
Yeah.
Done should almost be, we've got a thing, we've done the proof of concept, it works, it's performant, it's production ready, it's secure, we've deployed it, we're running it, and we have the ability to run this ourselves.
Yeah. And just picking up on some of those points, I think we know this so well in terms of just software generally about we need to focus on what the problem is we're trying to solve. So we can create all these different pilots and such like and show that, this new concept is working here. And okay, great. But what problem are we solving with that? What
Yeah.
ROI are we getting in return for that? And I think, being able to um, build these new capabilities so quickly, I think sometimes that actually becomes goes out the window more so now because you can do it quickly.
You
But
can.
actually, you
Yeah.
could build like 10, 20, 30 new solutions within a couple of days, right? But ultimately, you still need to understand what the problem is you're trying to solve to
Yeah.
then measure the success of that and then be able to build on that success and continue to measure. And I like your thinking around definition of done. And actually, almost in my mind, I'm thinking you could almost have that at each phase. So you could almost break this down into, the phases of how you want to deliver your AI solution and have those iterative, building blocks of what does done mean at this point, at this point, at this point, at this point.
Mhm.
So you're always keeping track of that and not losing sight.
I think that's a really good point. There's a point there around what you mentioned around you can do lots of things quicker. This feels like the first
Mm.
time ever that we're now at a stage where we're not constrained by execution. The
Yeah.
the the actual the constraint isn't how quickly can we do a thing. It's actually a question of what should we do, why should we do it, and we have. I mean, the way that we tend to do that is it's a very simple sort of triage framework where you kind of the three questions to sort of ask yourself when you're starting out. Essentially the analysis, finding documents, the why, the stakeholder agreement, the who, and then that sort of feasibility template, the how, and sort of making
Mm.
sure up front that you've got those things in place. And then really just having a very simple sort of three-gate decision model at that point. When you have a whole load of stuff coming into the top level hopper, do you approve it? Resources allocated to it, and off you go. Do you recycle it where you need to go around and actually have more discovery needed in order to be able to do this, or do you
Yeah.
make the decision to kill it and just say no, we're not going to look at that, we're never going to look at that, or do you shelve it
Yeah.
and say, you know what, maybe it fails its ROI criteria, maybe it fails the sort of feasibility statements, so there's something good in that, but we'll kind of come back and do it later.
Mm.
And I think there's at some level that there's a distinction between the engineering side of this and actually the sort of the business side of this, and
Yeah.
much like historical business process automation, things like RPA, where you are also working with the business to be able to fix business problems. Both of those sides are equally important, both sides of the same coin. So you need your engineers and you need those focused on the engineering to be able to do
Yeah.
those quick win developments, produce just sort of as much documentation as they need to, sort of been able to build it. But then you also need those business analysts to be able to really get into the nitty gritty of those requirements, but also to be able to help
Mm.
people on a journey. I guess when you're actually automating these aspects of it that people are doing day in, day out, that can be very, very important to them. And you need to get that right because that really does impact their ability to do their work if they don't. And one thing we've seen in terms of those feasibility studies, if you're starting off from scratch and you're wanting to build something, in my mind anyway, there's a few things that you need to keep in mind. First of all,
Yeah.
you don't want it to be technically too complex. Simpler the better. Simpler doesn't always mean easy,
Yeah.
different thing, but relatively simple. Um, if you have, and don't focus on some sort of big bang thing where somebody does something really complicated fairly irregularly. If you have simple things
Mm.
that lots of people are doing very, very often, that's where you can get a lot of ROI. Um,
Yeah.
so build that out within the picture and within the structure. But at the same time, if you can also select something as a fairly early pilot, which not only are lots of people doing it very often, and it's fairly simple, but people actually hate doing it as well. You're going to find you're going to get a lot more pushback in terms of from the people doing it. If you
Yeah.
choose something that takes away something that people like doing, that's a lot more impactful to them in terms of
Mm.
whether they want to do it and whether you're going to take them on that journey with them. Yeah. So it's, and I guess really at some level, this comes down to the right question I think to ask when you've kind of done this is, isn't, did you deliver the project? But actually, it's a case of, can our team maintain, iterate, and scale this without whoever it is
Mm.
that built it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that avoids that vendor locking as well that we've talked about previously, haven't we? Where you become so reliant that you're not gaining that knowledge in house and so on and so on. Just one thing I wanted to sort of pick up on in terms of the where we're talking about ROI and thinking about the problems that we're trying to solve, we need to think about this as a full system as
Mhm.
well. So looking at the system as a whole, and I don't mean technical systems, I'm talking about the system in which we work within across the business and how those things interconnect. So the different departments within your business, you might apply AI into one of those and it speeds things up, but then you create another bottleneck in another area because things are coming through too quick now. So when you're looking at these opportunities, let's say, you need to think about that holistic view and kind of say, if we do this here, what does that mean here? And so on. So, and obviously, we talked about we've been doing this sort of in the software and technology world for a long time. But if we're looking at how we apply AI into the business as a whole, and there's so many different opportunities, we need to understand how those things interconnect and how they can assist or potentially disrupt other parts of the business. Do you
Yeah, I
think?
think I mean, that bottleneck point is a huge one.
Yeah,
You one bottleneck, you just find another one. And you'll be
exactly.
constantly chasing those throughout systems.
Yeah,
And I think as well as what's the system do as a whole, um, the other thing to consider is also the different business functions within it. When people
yeah,
think of AI, it's often seen as a sort of a development thing. It's often seen as a
mm,
very sort of technical coding thing, whereas in reality, what's even more important is actually the sustainable operations and the support systems that kind of
exactly.
sit around it and how you integrate those within the existing support systems. So people are able
Yeah,
to take this on board. And in fact, with one of our customers, that's pretty much what we did. We had sort of not just building the bots, but also the support systems that kind of surround those bots. So
yeah,
integrating the agents with ServiceNow, automated remediation
mm,
as a first line of support before the humans kind of need to get involved. Um,
yeah,
and that becomes essential when you transition from pilots to agents at scale, because you've got to think about how do you scale up your support function. That's not
yeah,
necessarily the not necessarily the actual in terms of support function people necessarily. I mean, in actual fact, with one of our customers, we actually sort of practice what we preach a little bit, and an AI agent to automate the business function, but at the same time, actually an AI agent to automate the support function for those agents. So that kind of
mm,
service agent pattern. Now, the good thing about that is that whilst that can be quite hard to sign off because you're doing it in the background and it doesn't add immediate direct business value to what the end users are doing, but
yeah,
once you've done it once, you now get it for free with every agent that you're looking to build out from there. So automated
yeah,
logging, error handling, support ticketing, operational stability without needing necessarily manual oversight, because you're adding a lot more. If you have things that people did manually themselves and then you build these systems in, you're adding a lot more effort that does require management, as if it was another IT function that's been created. It's as if you've just brought this whole new software system into there. Um,
yeah,
but in actual fact, often you're the support. Unless you bought it in, if you have built this stuff yourself, this is
mm,
bespoke software that you are creating with all the challenges and implications that come with that in terms of supporting that, releasing that, managing that, and everything else off the
yeah,
back of it.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that, understanding you touched on there about human oversight,
Mm-hmm.
and human oversight is such a big part of, what we need to be applying to every phase of AI implementation, whether that's defining what it is, but and what it is that we need to do, i.e. the problem,
Mm-hmm.
but then also the outputs and the outcomes that we're achieving. Are we actually getting the right things, and and so on. And I think that's where sort of friction can start being created a little bit where um, we try and get too complex too soon, or and you start creating this sort of, I guess the word is more. No, we've used the word like imposter syndrome in conversations we've had with people, not feeling comfortable in certain areas, seeing how quickly something can be created, how quickly, oh, is that going to replace my role? And you start getting all this different type of friction building up. Um, and sometimes it's just more about, you know, keeping things simple and, building up slowly.
Yeah, 100%
So,
simplicity is key. That service agent model that we sort of described there, compounding, build something,
mm,
build on top of that, and then you're compounding the gains over time.
yeah.
That's hugely valuable. But there's certainly, in terms of that unblocking and in terms of that kind of overcoming friction, um, there's definitely a few things we've seen that you kind of really do need to think about sort of fairly early on, otherwise they sort of bite you a little bit further down the line. So I mean, there's a few
Mm,
failure patterns we've identified. So
yes.
um, the first one's things like the waterfall trap. People often designing these things will do it in a fairly sort of waterfall fashion rather than necessarily
Yeah.
the way in which agile technologists have done it for years. So specs outdated before the things even got out the door. We've seen that a few times.
Mm,
Misaligned values, so the focus on the theoretical needs over the actual operational reality of this with sort of zero tangible ROI. And in some
yeah.
cases, even unable to calculate that ROI because it was never defined up front, sort of what it needed to meet.
Yeah.
And we talked about the pilot purgatory thing, the actual never been able to get something into production.
Mm,
That's doubly impactful because not only are you doing it, but then also your conversation next time round with the business around wanting to do it again is diminished
yeah.
in value because they're saying, well, we tried this last time and we didn't manage to get it into production. Where's the ROI?
Yeah.
And there's an awful lot of fatigue, I think, throughout the industry with people now thinking we've invested a great deal in this and we're not getting anything for it. So before
Yeah.
we'll sign off on something new, you need to actually demonstrate some value to us that this is actually hitting the bottom line and been useful and effective within the
Mm,
business. And I think really, one other thing to bear in mind that we come across, often things are thought about a little bit more towards at the end rather than sort of up front. And there's some really important factors that need to be considered. Governance, the
yeah.
clearance there, the cybersecurity approval, getting that through your cyber teams, making sure that it meets that. Um, those are things that you really don't want to build in at the end. It's really
No.
hard to see what's going on the screen we've got. But I just saw a message flash up talking about guardrails. I couldn't read the
Yeah.
content, but I saw there's guardrails written on it. I mean, absolutely essential. Yeah, completely. Um,
Yeah.
and that needs to be thought through, and those need to be tested. You need verification in there. You need evals in there to know exactly what it is that you're doing, and not just pre-live, but also when it's gone live as well. Because
Yeah.
again, we're back to that point where you can't just put software into live and assume it's going to work in the same way. It will drift. It will get
It
things.
will.
It will massively get things wrong. And if you haven't got those guardrails in place and you haven't tested it, and you haven't constrained what these systems are able to do and what they're locked down to do and what they can and can't do,
Mm.
you're in a very, very tricky place at that point.
Yeah. And we were talking about this the other day, Ash, where you can't blame the AI. You can't say, oh, well, that was the AI's fault.
Mm-hmm.
Right. If something comes up and go, well, if there's a breach of security, well, that was the AI's fault. Well, no, you can't blame the AI for that. That's actually
Yeah.
your lack of governance and guardrails and such like. And it's really important. I mean, we talk about ensuring that we're engaging and bringing people in earlier in conversations a lot more now in tech, right? And making sure that the terminology of shift left and this kind of thing. But when you're talking about sort of, if you take cybersecurity approval as an example, because of how quickly you can build these things, you need to be engaging with your cyber teams early, so even earlier than you normally would, because that becomes a major blocker if you're wanting to get something out the door and actually, they're not involved and such like. So you need to be thinking about, not only can I just create this thing, you need to be covering off all these other elements as well in terms of what guardrails do we need in place, what levels of security, don't do those things pass, and looking at building that quality in throughout, having that assurance that you're building confidence as you go, rather than just trying to bang these things out really quick and then hitting these brick walls.
Yeah, and building it up front and engaging with teams that you wouldn't often normally engage in up front to be able to do this kind
Mm,
of thing. So you're absolutely right. Your cybersecurity team, your support teams, your sort of service management teams, but also regulators. If you've
yeah,
built the system with an LLM at its core, there might be very strict regulatory requirements in terms of explainability that you need to hit, in terms of being able to
yeah,
explain how your system made decisions in ways that it did. That can severely constrain the models that you use, or the types of approaches that you use. That needs to be
mm,
very clearly understood. Otherwise, you find yourself, and unfortunately, if you're not careful, throwing it away, because it's fundamentally doesn't meet those requirements from a regulatory point of view. Or
mm,
what you might find is that you can't go live just because you're blocked. If you ISO standards, other kind of things that need to be met before this thing can go out the door.
yeah,
At the very least, you're going to find yourself with an awful lot of work to do before you have all the assurances in place to be able to go live. At worst, you're going to find yourself doing an awful lot of rework or possibly throwing the thing away, especially after
mm,
you've shown stakeholders already this thing will actually work.
yeah,
That's a very tricky place to find yourself in. Yeah, I mean, actually, just going back to the friction point was one other thing that I just thought was worth mentioning. When we look at our systems and we're often automating things, um, we think about what can we do to make the system work in exactly the way that the human uses it, or that the system's used at the moment. Um,
mm,
and this is an anti-pattern that we sometimes saw within historical automation. It's kind of, you do this. Now, often that's very contrived and very difficult. A lot of the information that we use is sort of sat behind GUIs, it's sat behind gated environments where you need access to be able to log in. And in some cases, it's not even in a system, it's in somebody's head. Oh, you need to go and
yeah,
speak to Dave about that. Dave understands that. Or, we don't deal with that. Finance deal with that, for example.
yeah,
Aside from the technical challenges, those are very, very hard things to automate. So to
mm,
some extent, you almost want to come at this from the other angle and say, we will not just blindly automate processes that exist already. What we'll actually do is we will actually look at these and optimize those to be AI-able, for want of a better word. I don't think that is a term,
yeah.
but AI
Well,
works.
it is a term now, Ash. It's definitely a term now.
Yeah, AI, yeah, it probably shouldn't be, but maybe it will be.
Yeah.
AI works with Markdown. AI works with very open and clear file structures. It's able to
Mm,
work brilliantly with those things. But if you don't have that, it's making things far, far more difficult for yourself.
yeah.
Yeah. um, I mean, I'll just give you an example of that, one analogy. If you want to go on holiday or you want to go travel somewhere, you've got this. If you're traveling on your holiday somewhere, you've got this very efficient part in the middle, which is where you
Mm,
get on an airliner and off it goes, and you're doing 500 miles an hour at 30,000 feet to where you need to get to. Um, but that's not the whole story, is it?
no.
You need to get yourself to an airport at least 2 hours behind. There's a whole load of chuffing about. There's an awful lot of taking your luggage, putting it on things, taking it off things, hanging around.
Yeah.
And the actual efficient part is often you spend less time doing that and more time at either end messing around with it. I think
Mm,
that's a little bit like some of the, if you can make these systems so they are AI-able, there we go again. I think you will be much more efficient and effective than you'll ever be if you're trying
mm,
to use these, frankly, 20th century old way sort of systems. You're stuck you're stuck in baggage check-in, essentially, sort of waiting to go through
yeah.
security at that point, rather than sort of getting the value from it. Um, and so I think that's one thing that's often overlooked, and not that many people talking about that. There's often just an
Mm,
assumption that we will just automate these processes that exist as they are already. That
yeah.
set of thinking, if we just optimize this a little bit, and often it's not that much, we can save ourselves half the work and and
Yeah.
and half the maintainability. If you're having to talk to these systems behind GUIs, I mean, this from your own experience in test automation, it's very brittle. if you're having to drive that thing, you're very susceptible to changes and everything else. Whereas if that is just documented in a database in a markdown file somewhere or something similar, that's far easier to be able
Yeah.
to work with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, you know, we've faced into this same problem just, when, from a test automation perspective, when we don't build to make things automatable, let alone AIable.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's kind of just taking it to that next level of, going from that lift and shift mindset
Mm-hmm.
of we're
Yes.
just going to stay as is, lift and shift, and just apply AI over the top, almost like a wrapper over the top. Is that the right thing to do? Probably not. It's not really going to set you up well for the future. It might help put a sticky plaster over something in the short term,
Mhm.
but you need a longer term strategy around how do you build this so it is AIable moving forward in a more maintainable and sustainable way. Um, so yeah, and I think that's going to become and is already but going to become even more important
Mhm.
as more businesses try and adopt and integrate AI. And I wanted I and through that discussion there, what jumped out at me is about sort of risk and managing risk. Um, and we started talking about sort of guardrails and all that starts to sort of shape how we can potentially manage risk and sort of like thinking about the governance we need to put in, human oversight. But there's a lot more to it, isn't there, in terms of what we need to think about from a risk perspective, as we're building out strategy and looking at this, more holistically.
I think it's one of the most important things for sure.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. And that needs to be considered. It needs to be mapped. It needs to be reviewed. It needs to be documented up front. And you need to make sure the business is level is happy with that level of risk,
yeah,
um, because it's not magic. It really isn't magic. It's and once again, if you get to a stage where you've actually got something which is ready to go into production and you don't have that in place, and then somebody looks at it and says,
mm,
"Well, hang on a minute, what about this? You haven't thought of that. It's going to get blocked." Yeah. Okay. So, what do we want to? I mean, I think one thing that maybe we haven't talked about yet is um, how do you actually do this? How do you actually take this forward? Because a lot of our customers, they're talking about it, they want to do it, but they
mm,
can't quite manage to get it started. Um, they've maybe done a couple of pilots themselves in house, um, often in business teams, using tools
yeah,
like Copilot and other sort of low code, no code things. We see people using N8N a lot and that kind of thing.
mm,
Definitely some challenges with scaling that one. But how do you do it? And particularly, I think, how do you do it where you don't necessarily have the people in place to be able to do it? A lot of
yeah,
our customers, there's a couple of models, and in fact, we've got an event on Thursday talking about exactly this, where um, yeah, I guess you got that traditional consultancy model where if you don't want to do it yourself, you can sort of get an organization in to sort of help you with it, to be able to define it, to be able to put the meat on the bones. But then, sort of back to that point we answered first, um, how do we actually sustain that long term?
yeah,
How do we actually keep that in house? What do we actually do with that when the consultants have left? Because so
yeah,
often you see these things, they get built, and there isn't the proper handover. You don't have the people in place, and they're doing it often with the best of intentions. And then this stuff can tend to wither on the vine. Um,
yeah,
and the problem with it withering on the vine is that when it is sustaining your production business processes,
mm,
that's very different to it just being a thing, some new software that gets introduced, and then people think, "Oh, we're not going to use that. We're going to go back to the old ways of working," and sort of
yeah,
going that way. If you have taken the X number of people that were required to run that business process and you've put them in another area of the business, and you're no longer able to maintain this thing, you can't just bring them back. They're off doing something else. That's very, very tricky.
they are.
So, um, the model which we've got a hybrid approach, which is our consultants with our juniors, and then you have the option, but not the obligation to retain the juniors further down the line. So you're building your own
Mm,
permanent team. That's one approach. That's an approach that works well for a lot of our customers. But what I would say is, at the very least, if you're not doing this yourself, if you're bringing in contractors to do it, if you're bringing in consultants to do it, ask that question right back to what we said at the beginning in terms of that definition of done for this stuff. Not just what can we do with it, but how can we sustain it? You're not done
Yeah.
until permanent people in our organization are able to actually run with this stuff. And I think if organizations start asking themselves that question,
Yeah.
I think they'll be in a lot better place, because I think otherwise they are storing things up for further down the line.
Yeah, it's looking at the sort of the short term, medium term success of building, creating something versus the long term success of sustainable ROI and value longer term. And I think Ash, you're reading some messages, aren't you?
I'm
I
sorry.
can I can see you yeah, I can see
Sorry.
you reading. No, 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 it's fine. It's fine. It's absolutely fine. There's a lot of great chat going on. Um
I can't read them all. I'll scroll to the end one, and that seems to make a
yeah,
lot of sense. Yeah, historically, never been any dearth of revenue generating ideas from non-technical stakeholders. Yeah, well, isn't that the truth?
yeah,
Um, Vibe coding has democratized the ideation to functional POC, or worryingly MVP. Yep. I mean, at the same time, again, it's that point of reducing the speed of execution
yes.
to a commodity thing. But at the same time, what are the challenges further down the road with that? If you vibe coded something, how maintainable is it?
Yeah.
And to your point of the human in the loop, you need people there to be looking at that, to be able to manage that, to be able to ask the questions in terms
Mm,
of security, in terms of everything else, which is a risk there. But I think we're not that's not going to go away, right? I think we're going to see much more of that, and I think
mm,
the next level of abstraction, where you have, rather than people just vibe coding, people orchestrating multiple parallel agents vibe coding and trying to monitor those. We're going to end up with even more code getting out the door quicker. But you're absolutely right, Lee. That point on expectations around what constitutes a productionized, secure, compliant, robust, and scalable solution. 100%. That again is that
yeah.
chasm between pilot and production system. Yeah, an accepted governance framework to keep AI projects on track. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just conscious of time, Ash,
Sorry, yeah,
because obviously we want to get to some questions. Um, but we talked very briefly about avoiding that vendor lock-in and things like that. And where there's so many tools out there, there's so many AI partners out there. Um, and often it's like, how do you know, or where do we even start in selecting them? What questions do we need to ask them? Um, and I think if you can get that right up front, that often is a big help. Um, and I think, some of the things that we're talking about hopefully will lead people to understanding what they need to, what problems are they trying to solve, therefore what questions do they need to ask? Are they looking long term? Do they want an in-house long-term capability where they own the solution
yeah.
themselves? It might not be that they develop it, but long term they want to own it. So they need to make sure that they get that. Um, and thinking about things like governance and demand management, ensuring you've got human oversight. So even if you are working with a third party,
Mhm.
how are you applying that human oversight yourself?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So there's a number of things you can think about when you're going into these conversations. And I mean, there's so many tools out there, vendors out there that have just gone, we've got AI now, right? And it's like,
There's certainly a lot of AI washing, that's for sure. And in
yeah.
terms of that vendor lock-in, I think that exists at a few different levels.
Mm.
In actual fact, the very first level was just something, again, I shouldn't be looking at this, I should be focusing on what you're saying, but there's something coming here. I think it was Marco originally that said it. Do you always need an AI solution?
Exactly.
Often to that AI washing point, it's kind of like, it must be AI. Sometimes you don't. You just need
No,
good old fashioned software engineering to solve the problem, because Dan
precisely.
was saying, models use tokens. They can use an awful lot of them, particularly if you if you're not efficient in terms of what you're doing with it.
Yeah.
Back to those good old fashioned software development practices. But as well as that, the type of model, vendor lock-in at one level is about whose
Mm.
LLM you're using. And you should and can, in fact, there are lots of abstraction layers around these things. So you can choose what vendor models to use and at what level. But it comes back to that verification and to being able to put your arms around it and really understand the system, because there's no point in
Yeah,
over engineering a model and using a model which is way more expensive than the one you actually need, and fine tuning a smaller model and can get great results.
exactly.
There's all that going on in the mix, and if you're able to have those proper engineering practices, so frankly, the LLM that you're using in the system is largely commoditized. You can swap it at will and understand
Mm,
and know the impact that's going to have, if any at all.
yeah.
Um, that's a hugely powerful position to be in. A not powerful position to be in is where you've gone with a single vendor and you're entirely locked in to what they are doing, not just at the LLM level, maybe at the system level, the framework level, the app level, whatever that looks like. Um, because I guess at some level there is a huge amount of money being invested in AI and
Yeah.
not very much revenue being generated in comparison to that investment. And sooner or later, these are very large American VCs. For the most part, they're not charities. They're going to want that flesh at some point.
They're
They're
not.
going to want a return.
Exactly.
And if you are locked in to a particular vendor and a particular product, or you can't change your LLM because you know that it kind of works, but you're petrified of swapping or having anything changing in it, either through your
Mm,
choice or through the vendor doing something behind the scenes you're not aware of. That's not a great place to be in. At that point, you're beholden almost to a vendor.
you are literally, yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And yeah, Michael's just followed up. Also, people consider AI usage as nearly free, which, yeah.
Certainly, CFOs
It-
I've spoken to certainly don't consider it to be daily free.
yeah,
There's that classic meme, isn't there, going around saying, the developers are there when your model sort of tops the charts, and then the CFO thinking, when the bill hits the mat, and it can be, very much 210 or 100 times bigger the cost. And if you don't
it
have
can.
the ability to understand how you can safely engineer the cost out of that without impacting your business processes, that's not a great place to be either.
No, it's not at all. I think we should take some questions. Ash, what do you think?
Yeah, why
I think
not?
we've got a few coming in. We've had a few come in. We won't get to answer all of them, but so as I said at the start, we will. I'm going to move the questions up here so I can see them. But any that we don't answer, we'll take offline, and we'll go from there.
Let's have a look. Oh, there's quite a few here. Oh, this is an interesting one. How long does it
Go
typically
for it.
take to see ROI? That's a good one. I can give you a concrete example of that.
Hmm.
So with one of our customers, we we went from a place of saying, um, can we start working with you? They had about 50 ideas, to the point somebody made
Mm,
around non-technical people proposing ideas in a backlog of about 50 different proposed agents. Um,
yeah.
they had a supplier in there at the moment, but they just didn't manage to really get much traction. They hadn't actually managed to get anything live. They were stuck in the sort of, well, that pilot purgatory hell essentially. Um, and so our approach here was to, first of all, land a lead, land somebody who has experience of this, who can actually look at that and put the systems in place to be able to do
Mm,
it, including a few people talking about governance, absolutely governance. Um, and if you don't have that in place, then you can't build on it. So put that in place. Um, Prioritize that backlog. Understand from a technical sort of point of view what's required, what should be prioritized. Essentially, land the team. We talked about that combination of business people and devs working together, but also working on different things, so they're as effective as they can be in the areas that they're working in. We landed the team, and we had AI live, or AI into the hands of users and actually working and delivering value within the space of about, I think it's about 6 weeks, and then
mm,
building on that. And that's not a pilot. That's not, hey, this is how it works. That's kind of a case of, right, that's actually delivering value. So it can
yeah.
be quick, but you need to put the things in place. Lots of people are talking on the chat about the sort of architectural structure that needs to go in place. That
Yeah.
often when people are doing pilots and the pilots don't get very far, it's because they have not considered any of that at all. And then
Mm,
it bites them. You need to do that once, you need to do it up front, you need to do it well, and you need to bring people in from the various teams so that you do it once and once only, and then it evolves.
Yeah.
Once you get that right, you're much clearer in terms of that. So yeah, I mean, for simple agents, certainly, ROI should be weeks in my case, not it shouldn't be months. Shouldn't it's really about you're in there to add value. And to the point I made earlier, people are suffering from a little bit of fatigue with this. I think the time when people were prepared to sit around for 6 months and let people work away at something and
Mm.
then see if it delivered any value. I think that level of patience is long gone.
Yeah, I agree. Because and it's because so much money's being invested and spent as well, in that sense. Let's pick another one. So, how do you prioritize which AI use case to tackle first? So you kind of touched on this a little bit through the conversation.
Mhm.
Just expand on that in this instance.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of ROI frameworks, but really you're kind of wanting to, um, if you're starting from a standing start, particularly if you're trying to demonstrate value, you want to start with something simple. You don't want to go with something too complicated. You want to use something, and by that I mean not just complicated in terms of the decisions it's having to make and the level um, of cognition it's having to include, but also all the third-party systems it's talking to and everything else, and
Yeah.
different teams you might need to speak to. That can bog you down very quickly. You want something that's quite small, something that users can see the value of, and if you've done that calculation to see how much the organization is actually spending on that. So how many people are doing this thing? How often are they doing it?
Mm.
And sometimes we've seen people look at this and think, oh, well, it needs to be quite a big thing. It needs to be a thing that people are spending a long time doing. If you have 1,000 people spending 5 minutes every couple of hours doing something, and you can just make that completely disappear,
Yeah.
that's a significant cost saving, because it's also with people, it's a context switching as well. That's often overlooked. It's not just the 5 minutes, it's the 5 minutes to stop what you're doing, do that, park it again, pick it up, and carry
Yeah.
on from there. So there's that point there. And then to the point that somebody made earlier as well, it's the run costs as well of these things. So
Yeah.
so how many tokens is it going to use? What's that going to look like? What level of LLM does it need to see? You need that operational run,
Mm.
understanding the costs for that. If you're running it in the cloud, obviously there's infrastructure, there's data, there's storage, there's everything else. But the token cost for the LLM is just another thing to bolt on top of that as well. All
Yeah.
that needs to be considered. And then once you've got that in place, then it should become fairly clear sort of which ones to tackle first.
Yeah. I think there's a few things there you need to bear in mind, so to speak. It's not just a case of just building the thing. It's, all those other aspects you just mentioned. Um, Got one here from Jim. We talked about guardrails earlier. It's just, how do you make effective guardrails?
Mhm. Well, I think it's a question of, frankly, you have a stab at it, and then you need to verify them and you need to test them. Uh,
Mm.
and some of these systems, they walk you through that process. So, within AWS, within Bedrock, for example, that has a whole structure and system that allows you to
Yeah.
do and you're able to tune that at a number of levels. So
Yeah.
from the model you're using, sort of where you are applying it. But again, building them is one thing, but you've the only way they're effective is through testing them and keep testing them.
Mm.
And that's an iterative loop. If you're then in production and you find that something has been tested and something has gone wrong as a result of it, you need that feedback loop to then be able to fix it and then be able to go back through it
Yeah.
and to be able to do it. It needs to be monitored, it needs to be measured, and it needs to be tested.
Yeah. Yeah. Testing is very important. I'm not gonna lie.
It is. It is. More so now than ever. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
It
Absolutely.
used to be the case of once it went live, you could stop. Not anymore. Not by any stretch of the imagination. That's when it starts.
No. Yeah, that is when it starts. We got time for one more, do you think? Think we've got time.
Let me have a look.
I'll let you choose the
Let's
last one, Ash. Go
go
on.
on then. There's a few different themes here, isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We need to balance the business goals, responsible AI and security. Um, yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a question of what what the driver is there, and often security is that absolutely blocking point.
Mm,
Where often there are some things which is kind of, yes, you can balance it in terms of, well, if we don't quite get as much business value from that, then fair enough. But often those security requirements are binary. It's a case of you can't do that until you've done this, until
mm.
you've met these requirements. Um, yeah. And in terms of, I guess, responsible AI, I mean, what is your thoughts on that, Stu, in terms of responsible AI and what that kind of means?
So, I mean, and I may be misinterpreting this, but I'm thinking around sort of the more ethical side of AI and ensuring it's, maintaining that and it's not being used responsibly, I guess, in any way. Um, and keeping that in mind as you're building these things out, and what are your use cases? Why are you building this capability in the first place? Um, and also thinking about things like, where the bigger you're using bigger costs, you're spending more money. That has an impact, right? So we know like CO2 emissions and all this kind of stuff. Everything is driven by data in the AI space. If you're storing huge amounts of data, is it needed? So for me, when I'm thinking about responsible AI, I'm thinking about all of that and actually what's my impact on the environment as well as
Yeah,
my
yeah.
own cost and stuff like that. I may be misinterpreting what Babajid is asking, but for me, that's where my head goes when we start talking about responsible AI.
Mm-hmm. And I guess there's a huge part around the in terms of being aware of the fact and the data that you're holding and the data that you're governing on behalf of other people
Correct.
as well. I mean, often
Yeah.
that's also that's held within all kinds of other regulatory frameworks and everything else, which dictates what you can and can't do there. But yeah, yeah, okay.
And Babajid just said, I'm right. So I'm
Oh,
happy that I interpreted that correctly. But Lee mentioned there as well, AI safety number one, data privacy.
mhm.
Train data sets and prompts, absolutely right. So that, having being responsible for your data security, utilizing that, not storing more than you need, all these different things you need to think about, and whether you can afford to do it or not, is it the right thing to do? That's what you should be asking yourself.
I,
Um,
100%. And somebody actually said that in the comments as well, didn't they? Around, do
yeah,
you need AI at this point? Because I think the marketing's saying, "Oh my God, this is so easy, you can do it, and it's so amazing and so clever what it is that it produces and it builds." But at the same time, there needs to be that realization that there's a lot of responsibility with this. Maybe that's back
exactly.
to responsible AI. There's responsibility on the organization and the individuals that are creating this. Um,
Mm,
and recognition that it's not just a one and done. You're creating something, you're building something that requires
yeah,
needs a lot of consideration, um, a lot of work, not just to build it, but to run it and maintain it and to keep it going.
yeah,
And I guess don't underestimate that, which is what the main reason I think where so many of these pilots are failing, because people are just completely not thinking through many of the things that we spoke about and many of the things that people are talking about on the chat.
yeah, absolutely. Um, I think that's a great way to wrap things up, Ash. If I'm honest, I think I think this conversation has been really great. Hopefully, the audience has gained some insight and taking away some important points to go away and look at in your own businesses. When you're looking to adopt AI, integrate it, all these different aspects we've spoken about. If you're interested in learning more and from a 1010 perspective, how we can potentially support some of that, by all means, do get in touch as well. We're more than happy to have conversations around this. We can share examples of what we've done with some of our clients already. But thank you again, Ash,
Mhm.
for joining me
Oh,
in
thank
this
you very much,
conversation.
Stu.
It's been very lonely on my own, I have to admit. But thank you everybody else for joining as well. And yeah, we're going to be running more of these. We're going to be having another webinar at the end of February, which is going to focus in on prompt engineering and what good prompt engineering looks like and how you can apply that at different layers of your implementation and such like. So keep your eyes and ears peeled for that one. But for now, we shall say goodbye and wish you a good day. Take care,
Absolutely.
everyone.
Thanks very much. And thank you, everyone, on the comments and the questions. It's been really great. And thank you, Stu. Thanks.
Thank you.